And now to the musealisation of the Danish artist Franciska Clausen. Preparing for this paper, I realized that I had just, without thinking much about it, put the word musealisation in my title. However, that word might mean different things to us when we work with women artists. Should it point to the first museums interested in exhibiting an artist's work during her lifetime, or should it refer to the first acquisitions securing her representation in a museum collection? Or has musealisation not happened until we have secured a representative collection of the works of the female artist? The questions remain open, but if we define musealisation as, quote, the process of making something suitable for exhibition in a museum or conversion to the status of a museum exhibit, unquote, it seems that women artists, I think we can agree, have generally tended to be deemed less musealisable than their male colleagues. Today, I'll take the museum history of Franciska Clausen as my point of departure, but I'll do so to look into the narratives that surrounds it, and along the way, I will revisit stages of the early modernist exhibition and reception history in Denmark. And I should also note that this is a recently started postdoc project, and I'm talking a bit off my postdoc topic, so if you have any comments, please feel free. But first, for those of you who might not know Franciska Clausen, a bit of introduction. Franciska Clausen is one of the only Danish modernist painters who had an international career. Born to wealthy parents, she had the possibility to travel, and she studied in Weimar before the First World War, and right after the First World War, she began studying in Munich at Hans Hofmann's School of Art. He later became an art pedagogue in the United States. And she then became a pupil of Mogensen and later the sculptor Archipenko in Berlin. In 1924, she moved to Paris, where she became a pupil at Ferdinand Lisé's Académie Moderne, soon becoming so favored that she would help him complete and enlarge his paintings. Around 1930, she took part of the circle around Piet Mondrian and participated in the 1930 Paris exhibition Circle et Carré, Circle and Square. In 1931, she returned to Denmark, only to find an artistic climate not very hospitable for concrete abstraction. She tried exhibiting in Copenhagen in 1932, but allegedly she found little to none recognition and returned to her hometown, Åbenrå, in southern of Jutland, where she lived in relative remoteness from the art world, surviving as a realist portrait painter. If we are to believe the now standard account, she was almost completely forgotten until the 1960s and only fully rehabilitated after her death. If you are familiar with the art of Franciska Clausen, you will probably recognize several of these works. The record, the mechanic elements, the screw, the Mondrian-inspired artwork, and the surrealist The Fish. However, the realist portrait of the former Danish queen Ingrid in the right corner might be lesser known, as are actually most of Clausen's artworks dated after 1930. So actually I have two insufficiently defined terms in my title. For what is Franciska Clausen? When we adopt her only as a biographical coherent entity defined by the term avant-garde artist, we amputate her to make her fit a museum narrative which wants its artists to be at the top of the artistic development at all times. To this day, most books on her leave out the many portraits she made to survive and completely omits the strange food collages and the images she drew after popular culture in her later days, and also the small live portraits taking of the children of the city of Åbenrå. However, it was the last kind of artworks that come in prominent numbers in her collections, since that was actually how she made her living. So we have ample amount of sketches for those. Since 2012, the Danish art museum Brundlund Castle in Åbenrå houses a collection of 2,500 of her artworks. I think that's one of the good things about not being musealized. If you don't sell anything and you're able to keep onto it until it can be given to a museum, then you can actually kind of explode the idea of acquisition. But yeah, The collection until now is consisting of drawings, sketches, paintings, and collages. And it is owned by a foundation formed by heirs, and they're working in her best interest to musealize her. In other words, though her collections have been in museums almost always since her death in 1986, they're still only a deposit. In that way, the musealisation of Franciska Clausen has only just begun, and it can possibly take new turns. The collection awaits its final handing over from the foundation owning her collection, because according to its foundation's premises, the foundation will and can only hand over the artworks if a fitting store and permanent exhibition space is at hand. When this collection is secured in a museum, and I'm sure it will be soon, Clausen will even have a better museum representation than most male modernists in Denmark. In comparison, the relatively known Danish artist Wilhelm Lundstrøm has 416 artworks, Giersing 160, the surrealist Wilhelm Bjerke Petersen 420, and Cobra artist Asger Jorn 2,490 artworks in Danish art museums. So why even bother talking about this case when so many interesting women are still waiting to be discovered, to be included in a museum collection? In my opinion, this case is interesting because even despite of Clausen's ample overrepresentation, what a slip of mine, ample representation at Danish museums, we still talk about her in narratives as overlooked, previously lost, and now rediscovered. And it's also because presenting part of her life and her museum case makes visible some of the many energies and dynamics and interest involved when women artists enter the museum. Yeah, this is from if you need information of on a Danish artist, the Cultural Ministry provides an overview of what is in the museum collections. Lately, there has been an increased interest in Clausen's art. A posthumous landmark solo exhibition, Absolute Avant-Garde, in 2012, displayed many of the artist's major works, but actually she has been the focus of several exhibitions, biographies, and catalogues since the 1960s, when the Swedish art historian Oscar Reuterswärd wrote about her. Still, Clausen's own conceptualization of Denmark as the land of giving cold shoulders, de kolde skulders land, haunts the reception of her oeuvre. But to what extent is it fair to say that she was at all a lost woman artist? And how does verbal markers as lost, forgotten, or excluded shape the position and the space we are currently making for her and other women artists in museums and art history? We have to investigate, I think, how we lost her, when art history found her again, and in which version, and we must also ask, what part did the museums play in this history game of missing and found? Well, if art books counted as small collections, book museums, she has long since been musealized. For, as you can see on the slide, the stack of literature on her is ample, and this is only a selection. And more remarkably, it is only the two bottom publications that were not produced during her lifetime. As mentioned also, her art is included in several museum collections, was also included in several museum collections already in her own lifetime. Moderna Museet, Randers Kunstmuseum, Aarhus Kunstmuseum, etc. But to her what counted was to be included in the collection of the National Gallery in Copenhagen. But they acted with reservation. It was only around the 1st of March in 1986 that they brought two of her important compositions, the Gouache Contraste de Forme from 1927 and Circle and Carré from 1930. Her biographer, Finn Terman Frederiksen, guesses that the relief to be finally represented in the National Gallery might have caused severe emotional stress that might have led to her death. Fact is that she died from a stroke only a few days later in the morning, the 5th of March 1986. I was actually rather surprised to read his suggestions of this almost museum killing, but then again, museums have been eliminating women artists for so long that it almost seems plausible. But from this end to quite another beginning. When I began my postdoc last autumn, I also began working through the immense amounts of archival material preserved by the artist. She saved almost every scrap of paper, and her private archive is now at the Country Archive of Southern Jutland. However, it was in the museum's own archive that I found a newspaper clipping which was quite puzzling. And though it was not strongly related to the subject of my postdoc, where I investigate other patterns, networks, and rhizomatic structures than those closely linked to Clausen's biography and museum history, I decided to think a little about it. I'd just been presented to the fact that Brundlund, the art museum that houses her collection, hopes to expand the museum to be able to permanently receive the collection of Clausen's artworks. Imagine, therefore, my surprise as I found this article from 1986 stating that now the birth city of the artist would get its Franciska Museum. Please also notice how we sometimes belittle the women artists by not mentioning the last name. I hope in this case it was only to imply that in her hometown she was known so widely that no last name was needed to identify her. The article stated that the mayor was positive and the money was there. They only needed to find a suited piece of land. However, as mentioned, no museum has been built for her yet, so what happened back then? As I began reading through the subsequent articles, I found out that a combination of political changes and quarrels had ended the plan. An architectural competition was made, the money was there, but the plans came to an end because the municipality would only build the museum if the foundations would hand over her collections, and they would and could only hand them over if there was a museum to put them in. Franciska Clausen herself had been part of forming the foundation to take care of the collection. It was formed in the year of her death, and in the years after, with no Aabenraa museum inside, the foundation struggled to find a fitting place to deposit the artworks. They finally agreed to deposit the collection at the Museum Trapholt in Kolding, which in 1990 formed a separate department with an exhibition of works by Franciska Clausen. However, not much more happened, and in 2005, the Cultural Ministry of Denmark evaluated Trapholt, as are all art museums evaluated, and remarked that they had only just begun registering the collection. So when Brundlund Castle Art Museum opened in 2007, the former director, Christina Kampe, took up the struggle to bring back Franciska Clausen's collection to her birth town. The exhibition Absolute Avant-Garde, which brought Clausen on all lips in Aabenraa, convinced the foundation, and the collection was moved to Brundlund in 2012. But how had Denmark and the museums neglected Clausen in her own lifetime? In every account I have seen on Franciska Clausen, it is mentioned that she returned to Denmark in 1931 and had a solo exhibition in 1932, which was so badly reviewed that she gave up struggling for an artistic career in Copenhagen and moved back to Aabenraa. It seems strange, as I remembered that she had been promoted by the newspapers already during her stay in Paris. In an interview from 1924, when she had just arrived in Paris, she was described positively and was allowed to state her position. Quote, "I think that it is quite unique," says the Miss, "that a female Danish cubist exhibits in Paris. We are not many of that kind." And notice she does not mean female artists, she means cubists at home. There was Rude, but he gave up on cubism, and Lundstrøm, who's now an expressionist. So in my opinion, my impression is that I'm the only real one through and through, unquote. The interview was placed at the pages aimed at female readers and was very positive. But had all this really changed in 1932? Let's investigate an example. Under the heading, Woman World Artist, we find the following review, quote, "Franciska Clausen is a cubist, and that is her force. Within the framework of cubism, she unfolds her decorative abilities. With ample ornamental fantasy and skills, she fills the image plane according to the program of cubism and shines with a superior technique. A still life with a record is remarkable in this regard. Quite a masterpiece," unquote. The review was brief, but in my opinion, it cannot qualify as negative. It is quite the opposite. I've found several positive reviews, but none that read in their entirety can be described as only negative. And having an artwork proclaimed a masterpiece was really rare, since both male and female painters often received harsh reviews at the time. Let's look for a moment at a comparable example. I'll give you an excerpt from a review on the Danish artist Astrid Holm, because mentioning Astrid Holm also gives me the opportunity to mention a recent publication which will change the way Danish art history conceptualizes women artists. It is Hanne Ebbegaard's research publication on Danish artist Astrid Holm and her female colleagues, which accompanied an exhibition at Øregård Museum that has now moved to Rønnebergsholm near Næstved. Go see if you come to Denmark, and do not miss the opportunity to buy and read the book. Now imagine being Astrid Holm and receiving this review, quote, "Even with the most exaggerated kindness towards Impressionism and all kind of twisted oddness, it is impossible to feel any kind of sympathy for this paintress. When you paint trees as cakes and fields as cauliflower, humans as giraffes, it can of course be an original and funny invention, but it has nothing to do with art." And it continues, quote, "A painting like two model compositions made in Paris in 1910 looks as if it had been painting by a man in the last stage of an absent delirium. If Miss Astrid Holm wants to continue painting, she should stay clear of the French inspiration, but preferably she should stop painting," unquote. This review is from 1913, but the tone can be found in reviews right up to 1932. Still, Clausen remembers her reviews as evil, and when she later complained about them, she also mentioned the fact that they said that she could be a brilliant poster artist. Poster artists might sound negative, but she actually brought a lot of posters to the exhibition, and the title of the exhibition was Cubism Posters. I'm not trying to disqualify Clausen as a narrator of her own history. I'm sure she gave us her version of the story exactly as she remembered and felt she had experienced it. But as you can see from the examples here, she was actually a brilliant poster designer. But then what am I trying to do? I think I'm trying to complicate things a bit. Because if we expand our narratives and our search horizon, we might be able to uncover new traces from and gain new knowledge on the dynamics regarding female artists. In Denmark, at least, we have to shed habit thinking, because we need to be able to counter art history from postulating that the women were left invisible or left no important traces. Let me give you an example. In the otherwise brilliant Danish art historian Leonard Gottlieb's dissertation, published in 2011, he claims in regard to the 1/3 of female participants in the renowned autumn exhibition in Copenhagen in 1918 that, quote, "The women artists participated without sensation, without leaving any art historical traces or traces in the contemporaneity just remotely comparable to that of their male contemporaries," unquote. And he continues, quote, "Though Hanne Ebbegaard and Dorte Aasen, two really just brilliant Danish art historians, have worked to find artworks and rehabilitate, among others, Astrid Holm, it must be concluded that there has been no basis for rewriting the exclusively masculine canon," unquote. He does mention Franciska Clausen, but he discharges her because in his view, she was not connected to the Danish art scene when she returned from Paris. Today, we easily recognize, at least in this context, such narratives as faulty, neglecting, etc. But the history of lost and forgotten women is not necessarily a history of women not shining in their day or not being great artists. But it can be the history of an exhibition and collection practice that gradually made entire generations of women artists invisible to the public and art history. Using the words rediscovered, overlooked, lost when talking about women artists seems to the point, but sometimes I wonder if we thereby almost objectify them and make it more difficult to see the agency they had in their own time. In a Danish context, art historians often mention that no women were allowed into the Male Artists Association in the beginning of the 20th century. And this is true, but they were not at all unorganized. And in 1915, they formed a Women's Artists Society. They fought for their gender and they organized accordingly, while male artists were privileged enough to just organize according to their artistic interests. The idea of lost women artists often reminds me of a conversation from the book Lord of the Rings. It is the old Ent Treebeard making a conversation with the hobbit Pippin. Quote, "You see, we lost the Ent wives." "Oh, how very sad," said Pippin. "How was it that they all died?" "They did not die," said Treebeard. "I never said died. We lost them, I said. We lost them. We cannot find them," he sighed. "I thought most folk knew that." Now try exchanging Entwives for women artists and Pippin for the public, and imagine Treebeard as an art historian. Then the quote reads, "You see, we lost the women artists." "Oh, how very sad," said the public. "How was it that they all died?" "They did not die," said the art historian. "I never said died. We lost them. I said, we lost them. We cannot find them," he sighed. "I thought most people knew that." Well, in their own time, the women had different terms, but they were not lost, and they had agency. And a print re-identified by Hannah Abigail shows that the women did protest and take action. Here we see the Danish artist Olivia Holm-Møller comment on the artist Sigurd Svane, who organized an exhibition on modern art in 1925, and though he promised to include women painters, in the end, he just omitted them all. Olivia Holm-Møller shows us an aggressive swan, a pun on his name, keeping out the women artists who carry their artworks to the exhibition. And the caption in Danish says, "Modern Danish art, only for males." Kun for hanner. So how does all of this add up? I'm afraid I don't know just quite yet. But it might point to the fact that the musealisation of artists is not only connected to the museums, it's also strongly intertwined with some of the ways art history has narrated the disappearance and rediscovery of women artists. And Rosalind was kind enough to remind me that Priscilla Pollock had recently given a talk where she said, we should not talk about rediscovery, we should talk about discovering, because we are only just doing that, and they are there and they've always been there. So thank you for that. But we have to figure out where are the real sources of exclusion. In the case of Franciska Clausen, it seems that it was in fact not bad reviews that sent her back to Åbenrå. But I think the explanation has stuck in art history because it makes her fit into the narratives of women artists. Museums sometimes like that, and it makes it easier to cut her to fit nicely into the museum, or the previous museum was to privilege her works made before 1932. However, the later part of the collection strongly defines her as a gendered, a woman artist, because that part, the strange part of her works, is defined by her possibilities of making money and surviving as a women artist during the 20th century. So, and I just made a little list because I wanted to add 3 things that I think she would make her strange to work with in museum context anyways. Because we would, very often when we exhibit, we want it to be all oil paintings. And like the sculpture we heard about, she had no money for funding a studio, so she made small glasses in the intent to later enlarge them. But most of them she never enlarged, so we have a lot of small works, but not a lot of wonderful oil paintings. And then regarding the dates of the artworks, when she came in contact with the Swedish art historian Oscar Reuterwerth, he said to her, well, you should date, if you could remake some of the early works, you should just date them from when you first had the idea. So her complete oeuvre is a really catastrophic thing in terms of dating, because very often later artworks have really early dates. And museums don't like that. I think it just makes her more interesting. And then, of course, the last fact that I pointed to was that a lot of her artworks were not made during her avant-garde period, which we know best. It was actually made afterwards. But thank you for your attention.